The wind had been battering the walls of Harper's Hollow since before dawn, howling through every crack in my old farmhouse like it meant to drive me clean out of it. I'd stuffed rags in the gaps under the doors and kept the stove burning. Hot, but the cold still found its way in, creeping over the floorboards and biting at my ankles. My breath fogged in front of me as I sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in my dead husband's coat. Winters here weren't gentle, but I'd weathered them alone for years. That morning was different. Somewhere between the clatter of the shutters and the groan of the rafters, I heard something else, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, carried on the storm, but sharp enough to stir me from my chair. Not the wind. Not the house settling. Something alive. I took the rifle from its rack and stepped outside, each breath turning to ice in the air. The snow came nearly to my knees, a hard crust on top that cracked under my boots. The storm pressed against me, making each step toward. The barn felt like a fight. When I reached it, I paused. The latch hung crook. Someone had been inside. Pushing the door open, I saw them, a man slumped against the wall, his face pale and twisted in pain, and a little girl crouched beside him. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks flushed from cold. She had a small pup in her lap, shivering under a ragged blanket. The man's shirt was torn at the shoulder, dark with dried blood. He met my gaze but said nothing, his jaw tightening as if bracing for me to order them out. I kept my rifle steady. "You're trespassing." My voice was flat, practiced from years of keeping people at arm's length. The girl's eyes widened, and she pulled the pup closer. She didn't plead or speak, just looked at me like she'd been here before. That place between hope and dread. Something in that look hit me harder than the wind outside. I lowered the rifle. "Stay in the barn." My words were slow, deliberate. I didn't trust them, but I couldn't send them into the teeth of the storm. Without waiting for a reply, I turned and trudged back to the house. A few minutes later, I returned with a small basket, bread, jerky, and a jar of last summer's preserves. I set it just inside the door, not stepping closer than I had to. The man gave a short nod, but it was the girl's quiet "thank you" that followed me back through the snow. I didn't know who they were or why they'd come, but I knew one thing. The Hollow hadn't felt this full in a long time. Leah, I learned her name days later, began slipping into my routine without asking. She was small but quick, nimble in ways that made her a help even when I didn't want it. I'd head out to check the chicken coop and find her already there, scattering feed with that solemn, careful expression children get when they think they might be in trouble. She mucked stalls with a quiet determination, the kind that comes from knowing what hard work means, not from being told to do it. Matthew, the man, kept to the shadows of the barn at first, nursing his wound, but as soon as he could stand, without gritting his teeth, he found ways to keep his hands busy. He mended a broken harness without being asked, patched the sagging barn roof where the wind had peeled away the boards. He spoke little, only offering a gruff ma'am or a nod in passing. It was the quietest companionship I'd known in years. But the Hollow isn't far from Ironwood, and Ironwood has a way of knowing things it shouldn't. By the second week, I could feel the whispers before I heard them. At the Mercantile, conversation dipped as soon as I stepped inside. Folks traded glances like they'd been discussing something they shouldn't, and more than once I caught the word drifter, paired with my name. Sheriff Amos rode out one gray morning. I found him on the porch, hat in hand, breath steaming in the cold. "Evelyn," he began, "I hear you've got company out at the Hollow." His tone wasn't accusing, but it wasn't friendly either. I kept my eyes on him. "That's my business." He shifted his weight. "Maybe, but word is that man's got a past, and it's not the kind you want on your doorstep. Some say he's tied up in trouble over Ironwood's council, maybe worse. Men have been killed over less." The name Crowley came up then, soft but sharp. I'd heard it before, and not with fondness. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table, turning over what he'd said. That night, When I fetched more blankets for the barn, I found an envelope tucked into my mailbox. The handwriting was official, the seal even more so, Mayor Matthew Claiborne. The snow fell heavy around me, but I just stood there, staring at the name. I could take it to him. I could also take it into the house and pretend I'd never seen it. I slipped it into the pocket of my coat. By the time I closed the barn door, I'd made my choice. By the third week, Matthew's limp had worsened. I'd noticed it in the way he favored his right side when lifting feed sacks or in the long pauses he took when he thought no one was looking. I told myself it was his problem to manage, but when I found him gripping the barn post like he might fall, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Inside, I told him, opening the farmhouse door. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the snow as if he might argue. But the girl's gaze from the hayloft seemed to decide for him. He stepped inside for the first time. The warmth of the stove hit him like a blow. His shoulders sagged. I sat him down at the table, fetched hot water, rags, and the small bottle of whiskey I kept for pain. The wound in his shoulder was ugly, half-healed and inflamed, the skin angry red around the stitches. This should have been tended to weeks ago, I said, rinsing the wound. He didn't flinch, just watched me work. Didn't have the luxury. His voice was quiet, but something in it carried weight. Luxury? I asked, binding the shoulder with fresh cloth. That's when he told me. In low, measured words, he explained that he'd been sent by the governor himself to root out corruption. In Ironwood's council, corruption so deep it had bled the town dry. He'd uncovered too much too quickly. Crowley and his men had tried to silence him. The wound was their message. I paused, the roll of bandage in my hands. You came here knowing they'd follow you? I came here because I ran out of places to go, he said. His voice cracked then, just enough for me to see the man under the guard. He spoke of his wife, how she died in a fire set to drive them off their land. I felt the old ache in my chest, remembering my own husband falling in a stand against men not so different from Crowley's. The wind rattled the windows, but the silence between us was heavier. You should leave, I told him. It'd be safer for you. He gave me a tired half-smile. Safer's never been in the cards. I tightened the last knot in the bandage and leaned back. Then you stay. For now. It wasn't just pity anymore. I could see the fight in his eyes, and for the first time in years I recognized it. Life at the Hollow found a strange sort of rhythm. Matthew rose early to split wood or fix what the wind had battered loose, his limp easing little by little. Leah shadowed me like a second shadow, her small hands surprisingly deft at kneading dough or feeding the chickens. Evenings were quiet. Just the crackle of the stove, the pup curled near Leah's feet, and the occasional low murmur of Matthew's voice telling her some story I couldn't quite hear, but that calm had a weight to it, as if the land itself was holding its breath. It broke one morning when I found my calves slaughtered in the lower pen, not by wolves. No animal had left those clean, deliberate cuts. Whoever did it meant for me to see. The blood had frozen black in the snow, and a bitter wind carried the copper tang straight to my throat. Matthew came running when he heard me shout. One look and he knew. This is a warning, he said flatly. They're close. I turned on him. You think I don't know that? They won't stop until I'm gone. His tone was hard, but there was something else under it. Guilt. If you send us away now, you might still... No. The word left my mouth before I'd even thought it through. Leah stood a few paces behind him, clutching the pup. She didn't cry. She didn't ask. She just looked at me like she'd already packed her heart for leaving. That look cut deeper than any threat from Crowley's men. I walked over and crouched, so I was level with her eyes. You're not running anymore, I told her. Not from this. Matthew started to protest, but I cut him off. I buried one man because of the likes of Crowley. I won't bury another, and I'm damn sure not sending a child out into the snow. We buried the calves before the sun dipped, the cold biting our fingers through our gloves. As the last mound of snow settled over the bodies, I knew something had shifted. I wasn't just sheltering strangers anymore. They were mine to protect. The days after the slaughter felt different. Not quieter, nothing in winter is truly quiet, but heavier. Every creak of the barn wood, every crunch of snow underfoot seemed to carry intent. Matthew kept working, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes swept the horizon before stepping out from cover. He began telling me more about himself, perhaps sensing there was no use in holding it back now. He'd grown. Up not far from here, on land his father had nearly lost to crooked lenders. He spoke of his wife again, Anna, and how she'd been the one to push him into public service, insisting that someone had to stand up to men like Crowley. When she died, his fight turned personal. I told him my own piece then, how my husband, Thomas, had tried to hold our grazing land against the same men, refusing to sell when they wanted to expand their reach. One night, Thomas didn't come back from town. By morning, I was a widow, with a mortgage and a reputation for being stubborn as a mule. Crowley had come by once, smiling as he offered to take the hollow off my hands. I'd slammed the door in his face. We didn't speak after that for a long while, just worked side by side. But the threats didn't stop. One morning, I found boot tracks circling the barn, not mine, not Matthew's. Another day, a dead jackrabbit was left on the porch, its throat cut clean. Subtle enough that no lawman could call it a crime, but clear enough in its message. When I caught Matthew looking toward the hills with that calculating expression, I knew he was thinking about leaving again. I stepped into his line of sight. "Don't you dare," I said, his brow furrowed. "Evelyn, this is my home, my fight. You're part of it now, whether you like it or not." The tension between us broke into a strange quiet then, not the uneasy kind we'd had before, but something steadier. That night, as the wind picked up, I banked the stove and sat with him at the table. "If they're going to come," I said, "then let them find us standing." He didn't smile, but he nodded, slow and certain. It was Matthew's idea to walk into Ironwood together. He said it quiet over breakfast one morning, like he was suggesting we fetch more firewood. "If we want to stop Crowley, we can't keep hiding here. We have to face them in town." The thought of it made my stomach twist. I hadn't stepped into the heart of Ironwood in years, not since Thomas's funeral, but I saw the truth in his words. Staying at the hollow only made it easier for Crowley's lies to spread. We rode in under a low winter sky, the streets half buried in snow and lined with townsfolk going about their business, or pretending to. Word travels fast in a place like Ironwood. By the time we'd tied the horses outside the hall, eyes were on us from every porch and doorway. Inside, the air was warmer but thicker with tension. Crowley stood near the front, surrounded by his usual pack of allies. His smile was the same as the day he'd offered to buy me out. Smooth, smug, meant to hide the rot underneath. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "Didn't expect the hollow to send in a delegation." His gaze slid to Matthew. "Or for you to be parading around an outsider who's been skulking in our barns." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. Better an outsider with a purpose than a man who's been bleeding this town dry for years. A murmur swept through the room. Crowley's smile thinned. "Careful, Evelyn. Folks might start thinking you're defending him for reasons you wouldn't want to explain." I stepped closer, my voice steady. "I don't need to explain standing beside a man who's trying to help this town. What about you, Crowley? Care to explain where all the tax money's gone?" He started to speak, but Sheriff Amos raised his hand. "I think it's time everyone knows the truth. Governor's orders came down weeks ago. Matthew Claiborne was appointed mayor of Ironwood. The only reason it's taken this long is because some people have been trying awful hard to keep it quiet." His eyes flicked toward Crowley. The room went still. Crowley opened his mouth, then shut it when the murmur turned toward him instead. People began to recall the quiet repairs Matthew had made, the supplies he'd helped deliver, the disputes he'd settled without asking for payment. When we walked out of that hall, the air felt lighter. Crowley's grip had slipped, and for the first time it wasn't just me and Matthew standing against him. It was Ironwood. Matthew refused the mayor's house outright. The offer came from Amos the day after the town meeting, but Matthew just shook his head. The hollow's good enough for me. Better, even. So he stayed, and slowly Ironwood began to shift. It started small. A pair of brothers who'd once crossed the street to avoid me brought fence posts and helped mend the south pasture. Then Mrs. Dunley sent up jars of preserves for the little one. The blacksmith, who hadn't spoken more than 2 words to me in 5 years, arrived with a repaired plow blade and left without asking payment. Matthew never made speeches. He just worked, fixing broken shutters in town, hauling water for the older folk, organizing the men to clear the snow-choked road to the next settlement. Leah tagged along, her hair in messy braids, her pup bounding ahead of her in the snow. People who'd been wary of me for years began greeting me with nods, even smiles, and the hollow changed too. My kitchen became a place where neighbors stopped in for coffee and a warm fire. The barn echoed with the hammering of repairs done by more than just my 2 hands. On Sundays, the porch filled with folks swapping news, while Leah slipped cookies to her pup under the table. Crowley was still in town, but his shadow had shortened. Without the council in his pocket, his bluster meant less. Now, when he passed by, people didn't bow their heads. They watched him. One evening, as we sat on the porch, Matthew looked out over the snow-dusted fields and said, "Funny thing about belonging. Sometimes it sneaks up on you." I didn't answer. I just sipped my coffee and watched the last streaks of daylight fade over Harper's Hollow, knowing he was right. What had started as a refuge for 2 strangers was becoming something bigger, a place worth standing for, worth keeping. And for the first time since Thomas's death, I could see the hollow not as what I'd lost, but as what I'd built. The wind had settled by the time the sun began sinking behind the hills, leaving the world wrapped in a cold stillness. Matthew sat beside me on the porch steps, his hat tipped low. Leah curled between us with the pup, tucked against her coat. The boards beneath our boots creaked in that familiar way, like they'd grown used to holding us all together. We didn't speak for a while. The horizon was awash in gold and deep purple, the snow catching the last light and scattering it like shards of glass. I thought about all the winters I'd sat here alone, watching the same sunset and feeling nothing but the ache of absence. Ever think about belonging? Matthew's voice broke the quiet, low and thoughtful. I glanced at him. Not much use. In it before now, he nodded, eyes on the horizon. Belonging's not about where you're from. It's about where you choose to stay, who you choose to stay with. The words settled in my chest heavier than I expected. I thought of the long, empty years after Thomas, of the faces in town softening, of Leah's quiet laughter as she worked beside me, of Matthew mending the fence without being asked. Belonging, I realized, wasn't given. It was built. One shared chore, one risk taken together, one winter night endured side by side. Leah shifted against me, letting her head rest on my shoulder. "We're not leaving, are we?" she asked, almost whispering. I smiled, my arm wrapping around her. "No, sweetheart, we're home." The sky darkened, the first stars pricking through. Somewhere in the barn, the horses shuffled in their stalls. I breathed deep, tasting wood smoke and cold air, and felt something I hadn't in years. Not just safety, but peace. We didn't need the mayor's house, or titles, or even the town's approval. We had the hollow, and we had each other. And that was enough. The storm that had brought Matthew and Leah to my door was long gone. In its place was something quieter, but stronger. A promise made in the silence of a winter night. We were staying together.